Robert Jenrick, welcome to the Spectator's leadership hustings. To begin, can you give us your 2-minute opening statement on why you should be the next Tory leader?
Well, Katie, thank you for having me. Look, I think this leadership election is not as some have billed it. It's not about left or right. It's about continuity or change. When any political party loses an election and goes into opposition, particularly one like ours, which has just suffered its worst ever electoral defeat, you're at a fork in the road. And there's one path, which is the path that I would say Ed Miliband took the Labour Party down in 2010. It's the path that, in honesty, my party went down in 1997. That is the path of putting your fingers in your ears, pretending that nothing has gone wrong, hoping that the electorate has buyer's remorse, and that we can somehow get back into office. I'm not going to take the Conservative Party down that route, because that is a dead end. That leads to years in the political wilderness. That is letting the party, but more importantly, the country down. The harder road is the one that I want the party to go down. That is where you do the most difficult thing in politics, which is to accept that perhaps you didn't get everything right. You listen to the public, you repent for the mistakes that were made, and you set the party on a course which is different. That is the way to get back into office. That is the slow but hard road back, where you regain the public's trust and confidence. And I think we do that by having serious answers to the big questions facing our country right now. One is the economy. We said we were going to deliver strong economic growth, but in fact, growth was too slow and taxes were too high. We lost our hard-won reputation for sound management of the public finances. One was on the NHS, where we said that we were going to deliver a strong NHS, but in fact, 1 in 8 of us is on an NHS waiting list. And we didn't do what Conservatives are supposed to do, which is to reform the public services. We treated the NHS like a religion to be worshipped, not a public service to be reformed. And perhaps the most important of all was immigration, where we promised that we would control and reduce immigration, that we would secure our borders, and we did precisely the opposite. That was ultimately why I chose to resign from the cabinet at the turn of the year. And so I think that the path back for our party is to accept those mistakes, to be painfully honest about them, to listen to the public, to unite as a party, but not with platitudes, to unite with a strong church, but one with a common creed, a sense of purpose once again. I think if we do that, then we can win. We can win the next general election. That's what I want to do. I want to be the change candidate in this election. And I hope that the membership and the country will respect that and appreciate that whilst that might be a mountain to climb, it is the only way back for the party.
Now, what do you think the dividing line in the contest is? Because I think when we had these hustings at the last leadership election, it ultimately seemed as though tax rises and the question of tax cuts in the economy was the dominant one. What do you think it is now?
I think, as I've just said, it's continuity or change. There are some who want the party to continue with a failed status quo. That's not me. I want the party to be honest about what it got wrong. And I think the reason we lost the general election was, of course, in part because of tactical mistakes during the election campaign. But the seeds of our defeat were sown long before then. And it was that we just didn't deliver for the British public on the fundamental issues that everyone in our country cares about. And they are the economy, the NHS, and immigration. And why didn't we deliver? Well, a part of that is that we lacked a purpose as a party. We forgot what we stood for. We were not clear about the enduring values and principles of conservatism. So what I want the party to do right now is have a clear diagnosis of what went wrong. And I believe I have the best diagnosis. Then set out what is the purpose of our party? What is the mission of this party around which we can unite? And then take the party forwards. And with a government now in place, just 8 or 9 weeks in, which seems to be so stale, despite the fact that it is so fresh, I think the public will yearn for and will respond to an opposition which is so honest, which sets out the trade-offs on the big issues and has a course forward for the party and the country, which tries to tackle the central issues facing us right now.
Now, you mentioned immigration, and I suppose for our viewers and readers, they might say, well, hang on a minute, you were Home Office Minister. Didn't you have a chance to improve some of these things that you're now saying are a failure? Now, of course, you did resign from that role, but what would you say to them on that? I mean, were there things you saw from the inside which meant that the system was harder to do? Or do you yourself think actually there are things that you could have done differently in retrospect?
Well, look, I think that the work that I did in the Home Office with others put the country in a better place than when I arrived there. We campaigned relentlessly for changes to our legal migration system, and I personally secured the biggest reforms in recent years, which will reduce the number of people coming into the UK legally by around 300,000 every year. And that would not have happened, frankly, if I hadn't made the argument to the Prime Minister, Rishi, at the time, in the strongest possible terms. I also pushed to ensure that the Rwanda policy was strengthened, because it was so important to me that we actually made good on that central promise to stop the boats, because I felt it was doing so much harm to our country. It was so damaging to the reputation of our party that we were seen to be making promises and then breaking them. But ultimately, having done that and not having got as much as I felt was necessary, either on legal or illegal migration, I chose to resign. And I did that for two reasons. Firstly, because I didn't want to be just another minister who made and broke promises on one of the most important issues facing our country. But I also didn't want our party to keep making and breaking promises. I think that was immensely corrosive to public trust in us. It was one of the central reasons why we lost the election and lost it so badly. And now, standing to be leader of the party, I want to do things differently. I want us to adopt crystal clear positions on migration. I want us to say that we will set a legally binding cap in Parliament so the public can trust that it will happen this time in the tens of thousands or lower. And I want us to be clear on illegal migration, that we're going to adopt the maximalist approach that I sought to persuade the Prime Minister of at the time, with the support of 60 Conservative MPs. And that is to say that if you come here illegally, you'll be detained and removed either back home to somewhere safe like Albania, and you will remember I signed the deal with Albania, or to a safe third country. And that in order to do that and ensure that policy succeeds, we'll have to leave the European Convention on Human Rights.
We're trying to find some positives. Which Tory leader from the past 14 years do you have the greatest admiration from, or would you look to learn some lessons from were you to become the next leader?
Well, I think I'm the only candidate in this leadership election to have served in the government of each of the last 5 prime ministers. And there are good things I would draw from all of them. I think Boris was a fantastic campaigner. I believed very strongly in the levelling up agenda, which he and I created, because I grew up in Wolverhampton. I represent a small town in the Midlands. I think it is important that we are a party of the whole country. I respected David Cameron's professionalism and the competence that he brought to government, which is obviously going to be a critical component of how we can restore public trust. But if I reflect on the last 14 years and all of those prime ministers collectively, I think it's clear to me that none, perhaps barring Liz, had a very clear sense of where they wanted to take our country. And that is what we need now, because it's all well and good to talk about unity and uniting as a party. Of course we've got to. But unity doesn't come about in and of itself. Unity is born of purpose. And what I want the Conservative Party to have now is the ballast of a clear set of principles and a very clear sense of where we want to go as a country, which I don't think, frankly, the Conservative Party has had, probably since my childhood when we had Margaret Thatcher as our Prime Minister. And I've begun that process. I'm the first candidate to set out what I think the principles of conservatism are. I wrote an article in the Telegraph a few weeks ago where I set out the 10 principles of conservatism, not as the sort of 10 commandments that people need to parrot North Korean style, but as a starter for 10, where we have a debate as a party as to what we believe in and then unite around that. And I think we should also use this leadership election to settle some of the disputes, the arguments that we've had as a party. For example, should we leave or remain within the European Convention on Human Rights? I think let's use this opportunity to air in a positive way our policy questions, which are legitimate, reach conclusions, and then move forward as a party together.
So let's run through some of those policy areas. You mentioned the ECHR. Is it your view that really we are on a path where it has to be left rather than reform, which is what other candidates are talking about?
Reform doesn't exist. It's a binary choice. You either leave or you remain. And I think we should leave. There are those who say that we should attempt to derogate. That's impossible. There's no serious lawyer or expert who has looked into this who thinks that we can derogate. The convention only permits a state to derogate in the most limited circumstances where there is a threat to the life, the existence of the nation. And even then, it says that you cannot derogate from the articles in the convention which are most used in immigration cases. So that I'm afraid is not an option. Then there are those who say that we could enter some sort of reform process where we seek unanimous agreement of other member states. There's no process to do that. There's no consensus on what that would be. And there's no realistic prospect of success. At best, that would be a process of decades, and it would be as doomed to failure as David Cameron's attempt to renegotiate our membership of the EU. I don't think the public are willing to wait decades. If we were lucky enough to re-enter government in the future and were given a second chance to secure our borders and to tackle these allied issues like terrorism and the removal of foreign national offenders, we would not be given a third chance. We'd have to get on and do this swiftly. So I think we all face a simple choice. Do you want to remain within it? If you remain within it, you are consigning this country to illegal migration for decades to come, with all the consequences that flow from that. Or you can leave, fix these problems once and for all, and then settle the migration challenge that we've faced as a country and move on to talk about the other things that we care about in British politics, like education, the environment, the health service, the economy. That's where I am. I think that's where the membership of the Conservative Party is. And I think that's what we can persuade the country is the right way forward for us all.
Yeah, I mean, I think membership polls suggest that some are with that idea, some are not. It slightly varies on the polls. But I suppose you talk about leadership and having a clear vision as being very important. What's your approach then if, with some of these quite clear, bold ideas, we've seen the previous leaders try and compromise on the problems that come of it. So there's never an easy solution. If you have some Tory MPs say, I will never support leaving the ECHR. I don't want to be in a club with Belarus or Russia. That's often the line you hear. What's your approach on discipline? Is it going to be a party where everyone's allowed to have different views, or do they have to get behind the position of the leadership?
Well, firstly, just on the single issue of the ECHR, I don't think it's nearly as contentious as some people would like to suggest. Remember that there is now a consensus in the party that it is not working. And at the very least, serious reform is necessary. The difference with my position is just one step further, which is to say that perhaps unlike other contenders in this leadership election, I have given this a great deal of thought. I have spoken to our European partners, the interior ministers and immigration ministers, and have concluded, as many have, that reform isn't possible. Therefore, we need to do what is necessary and leave. I'm very confident that I can persuade the parliamentary party and the country that that's the right way forward. And in fact, you see from the broad spectrum of people who are supporting my campaign in the parliamentary party, people like Victoria Atkins, for example, that people are coming to the view that this is necessary, both as an individual issue and in order for us to settle the running sore of migration, which has been so challenging for our party and for politics more generally, and enable us to move on to discuss all those other issues. In terms of bringing the party together more broadly, you're right that we've got to get away from the disunity, the pettiness, the squabbling that we've seen in recent years. I think I'm somebody who can create a team. I've worked in the governments of all of those different Conservative prime ministers, very different individuals. They've all had good relationships with me. I think I have positive relations across the party. But I think it is clear that when I use this phrase, I want a broad church, but one with a common creed, there has to be some kind of religion at the heart of our party. You've got to believe in something and have a clear sense of what the purpose of the party is. And so if there is a small minority of people who cannot get on board that train, then the train has to leave without them. because we cannot be a party that appears to believe in everything and nothing. That is one of the reasons we lost the election. And it pained me when I was knocking on doors to have people saying to me, I don't know what your party stands for. I don't know what the difference is between you and the Lib Dems and the Labour Party. I never want that to be the case in the future.
And if, say, hypothetically, because we all know politicians love hypothetical questions, the group are not getting on the train and they're on the platform, are they still going to have the Conservative whip, or is it more that you're going to press on anyway? Because one of the things that I think has turned off voters is the sense of this constant, public debate and infighting over policy positions.
Look, no, I think I'm confident that we can build a strong sense of team, bring people together, whether it's on that issue or others. I don't think you're going to get into the kind of situation that you're envisaging. But the key thing for me is that we do have a broad sense of what we actually stand for and a sense of purpose again for the party, because that actually is the root cause of the infighting, the squabbling, the disunity. It's the lack of purpose.
Now let's get through a few more of these policy areas. Now, we're speaking ahead of Reforms Conference with Nigel Farage, and I think moving to what they would call a more sensible net zero policy is quite a key part of what they're saying. Do you think the current net zero goals are realistic? For example, net zero by 2050, some of the ones on the way?
I advocate a different energy policy to the one that we've pursued, and certainly from the very harmful one that Ed Miliband is now embarking on. I do think it's important that we meet our net zero commitments, that we do decarbonise our economy. But I accept that this is one of the biggest changes, in fact, the biggest change to our society and our economy since the Industrial Revolution. And we need to take an altogether more pragmatic approach. I'm not going to do this on the backs of working people and by further deindustrializing our economy. We've got to adopt a national position where we're seeking cheap and reliable energy in order to maintain our competitiveness and to support households across this country. Industrial energy prices have risen threefold in the last 25 years. They're 4 or 5 times higher than the United States. It's not possible for us, like other European countries, to maintain a steel industry, a car industry, critical strategic industries and sectors in this country if we continue down this route. So what I'm advocating is a break from the recent past. It is to say that we're going to adopt a more pragmatic approach. We're going to invest in new nuclear. We're going to concede, accept the inevitable, that gas is here to stay for the medium term, that the Labour Party's approach of trying to remove gas from the grid over the next 5 to 10 years is impractical and would be harmful to the economy. I think if we adopt this approach, then we will be able to have a much more realistic attitude, which will help us to drive the competitiveness of the British economy.
And just on that, do you think that's going to play well in some of these, for example, blue wall seats that the Lib Dems have made inroads to? You'll often hear people say, oh, well, they actually really like the net zero thing. Some of the MPs who actually lost their seat would have net zero champion in their Twitter bios. Do you think there's a risk in terms of losing some voters on that side, or is it getting the argument across?
I think it's about persuading people rather than provoking. That is my style generally. It's taking on difficult issues, but trying to make an argument. And of course, we care about the environment and conservation. That's the essence of conservatism. I love this country. I want to hand the countryside on to my children and grandchildren in a better state than the way that we found it. But I also want to ensure that working people can afford their household energy bills, that we have an industrial base as a country. And I'm deeply worried by the cycle of low economic growth that we found ourselves in, not just in recent years, but since the financial crisis, and in fact, before then. That's not unique to the UK, it's unique to Europe more generally. And we have to have a proper plan to change that. The Labour Party do not. They say that they are pro-growth, but almost everything they do is anti-growth. There's a real role for the Conservatives now to come forward with practical policies, whether it's on energy, whether it's on welfare reform, whether it's on planning and housing, whether it's about the skills base in this country, giving young people real skills, not low-value degrees, whereby we can be the party of growth once again.
Now, foreign policy. Looking at, I suppose, the current UK positions, is there a UK position on foreign policy as it currently stands that you think needs to change?
Well, I've taken positions since leaving government on, for example, China and Iran, which are somewhat tougher than the ones that the government has taken. I think that China is a threat and that we should call it that. that we should be much more careful in the way in which we protect our strategic industries, our universities, the R&D in this country from Chinese infiltration. I've spoken for a long time about the threat of Iran. I spoke about the naivety of the Iranian nuclear talks at the time. I was sanctioned by Iran, for example, for calling for the IRGC to be prescribed. I restated my argument for that in the Telegraph just this week. So I want us overall to take a more realistic approach to who our allies are, who our enemies are in the world today. I want us to be investing more in our armed forces. And long before this leadership contest, I argued that we should be spending 3% of GDP on our armed forces. And because I'm a fiscal conservative, and it's the easiest thing in the world just to call for more money to be spent on the armed forces without saying how one would do that, I said that we should be taking money from our international aid budget and spending it on defense, doing so more intelligently in terms of procurement than we have recently. But that is a better way for the UK to fulfill its role in the world and to protect the interests of our citizens.
On China, if you become Tory leader and potentially Prime Minister, would part of this approach mean your foreign secretary or shadow foreign secretary would not visit Beijing?
Well, I view China as a threat. And I think as a result of that, whilst of course we have to have a line of communication with such a major international state, I think you would have to adopt a more circumspect approach to the way in which we deal with them and to be very clear-eyed about how we engage with them, more so than we have in recent times.
Perhaps less hobnobbing than some of what we see at the moment.
Absolutely. Yes, 100%. And allied issues to that, which may seem small, we should be very clear on, like the Chagos Islands, for example. Why would a country like ours in a generational struggle with China be so careless to give up our only strategic asset in the region? Those are clear mistakes, which I'm worried about, where we need to take an altogether different approach.
Now, in a few weeks' time, Americans will go to the polls to vote for their next president. If you could cast a vote, who would you vote for and why? Or would you abstain?
Well, look, firstly, I'm not a citizen of the United States. I don't think it's wise for people who are aspiring to be leaders of political parties or prime ministers to comment on who or who should not be president of the United States. I am a conservative, and the Conservative Party has long established links with the Republican Party. We lean that way, and so it's natural for us to support Republican candidates. I see merit in some of the things that Donald Trump has said and done, for example, on immigration. But of course, I don't agree with everything that he stands for. I would work with whoever is elected this autumn in the United States.
One of the big issues that's coming up in the House of Commons potentially this year is assisted dying. And the idea that Keir Starmer, yes, through backbench MPs, private members bill, but ultimately it's something that he seems quite supportive of in his comments. And this wouldn't be an issue on which a party was whipped. It's a conscience vote. But I wondered, where do you sit on that? Is that something you would back or not?
Well, I understand where this came from and the yearning of some to change the law. One of the most formative experiences of my childhood was my own grandmother who lived with us and who lived with a very long and debilitating and ultimately terminal illness. And I watched her suffer. And whilst I don't think she would ever have wanted to reach for assisted suicide, it showed me how painful it is for some people to approach death in that manner and for their loved ones to watch it happen. So I understand the motivation, but more recently, I have been very concerned about how this is playing out in practice in some other countries, particularly Canada, where you've seen instances of people being encouraged, forced down a road of assisted suicide in circumstances that clearly do not warrant it. So I am very circumspect, to be honest, about this. I worry that Keir Starmer is rushing into a very legally and morally complex area without giving it the thought and care that is necessary. And unless he could persuade me that the safeguards were in place to prevent our law being one as open to abuse as the one in Canada, for example, I would be prepared to vote against it.
Now moving to the NHS. it's obviously something you spoke about in your opening statement. You have Wes Streeting, who's talking about further reform, use of the private sector. I just wondered, how committed are you to the principle of free at the point of use for all? Because there's obviously lines in terms of when people might be in a better place to go and use private healthcare and things. And it is obviously such a huge amount of the current tax burden.
Well, it's entirely up to private citizens whether they go private or not. But I support the fundamental principle of the NHS as free at the point of delivery. And it's something that, in many respects, we're proud of as a nation, because it gives us all a sense of security that we need in life. My concern is that we as Conservatives in government have treated the NHS as a religion to be worshipped, not as a public service to be reformed. We've shirked difficult decisions. We've seen the structural flaws in the NHS, and yet out of fear of being mischaracterized by our opponents, we've not taken those difficult decisions. We've jumped at our own shadows. And so what I want us to do now in opposition is to, with a degree of humility, work with people, doctors and nurses, those on the front line of the NHS, to think very carefully about the serious reforms that are needed to drive up productivity, to embrace technology, to ensure that we are preventing people from getting into hospital and expensive and needless care. Doing the things that a good Conservative government, frankly, should do, which is caring about the patients, caring about taxpayer value. I've said publicly that if Wes Streeting actually comes forward with serious reforms that are in the national interest, which do try and drive up productivity, I would support him. I think we should adopt a mature attitude to opposition. The public would respect us for that. But the revealed preference of this government so far has been for bowing to vested interests, caving to trade union paymasters. So I'm skeptical. I think the jury is out as to whether Wes Streeting will do any of those things. But I would adopt that approach and use our time wisely to draw up some serious reforms. So if we're in government in the future, we do the things we didn't do this time, and that we are great reformers of the NHS in the way that we were for education in the 2010s.
Now, I want to come to some final quicker questions, but just the last one before we do that is just about free speech, really. Now, ultimately, it's a big debate playing out, obviously, on campuses, but particularly online, I think, in relation to the recent riots that we had. We had the online safety bill, which obviously the Tories produced, which had free speech advocates and tech giants questioning parts of it. Elon Musk has been heralded by some as a champion of the free speech debate online, but also by others as a danger of online harms. Where do you stand on Elon Musk? Hero, villain, more complicated?
Well, look, on freedom of speech generally, I take a very strong line. I think that freedom of speech is in danger here and across the West, and that we should be standing up for it. And as Conservatives, there's a particular role for us in doing that. In fact, one of my reasons for wanting to leave the ECHR is to create a British Bill of Rights which would enshrine stronger protections for freedom of speech than we enjoy today. I opposed some of the aspects of the online harms bill. I said that this idea that something that would be legal offline should be illegal online is wrong, and that we should not be legislating for that. And if Keir Starmer were to bring forward new laws, I would be very concerned about further regulation in this area. Of course, as a parent, I care passionately about what my kids are seeing online and want to find ways of protecting them from harmful content, but that should not come at the expense of broader freedom of speech. And I would want to make sure that we are always standing up for that and voting against perhaps well-intentioned, but no doubt harmful laws that would set us on a path to restricting freedom of speech in this country.
And just on Elon Musk, do you think he has his ownership of X, which often dominates debates? Do you think that's been a good thing for the platform or a less good thing?
I don't have a strong opinion, to be honest, on Elon Musk. I'm not going to go and do a.
He seems to have a strong opinion on.
I'm
Keir
not going to be doing
Starmer,
an X live at
or the Rishi Sunak style.
Exactly.
Obviously, you're not going to have an AI summit.
I'm interested in AI, but I'm not going to be booking a tete-a-tete with Elon Musk anytime soon.
There won't be a fireside chat. Okay, glad we've established that. Now, a few just final questions. How do you think your colleagues regard you?
Well, look, I think they have seen me as someone who worked extremely hard as a minister. I hope they feel that I was competent and capable as a minister. Somebody who believed in politics as a team sport, somebody who's always out there on the media, defending them, trying to work collegiately. But I think they've also seen me as somebody who ultimately stands by my principles. They saw that when I chose to resign from cabinet. I think that they know that I believe in things, that I'll always stand my ground, and that I've got a very clear sense of where I want to take our party in the future.
What do you think, looking back on the past 14 years, is the most conservative policy that was delivered? And perhaps I would assume by that perhaps the one that you like the most. But yeah.
The welfare reforms that Ian Duncan Smith and others did in the early days of the coalition government, I think it was morally right and it was economically right. It was making work pay. It was ending the sick note culture that we'd inherited from Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. And it was helping people into the dignity of work. And it set us on a course for one of the great achievements of this government, which was more than a decade of very low levels of unemployment. And there's almost nothing more important that a government can do than ensuring that people in work, looking after their family, having the dignity of work. I want us to get back to that and bring forward more welfare reforms in the future.
And following on from that, what do you think is the least conservative policy of the past 14 years that this government has delivered?
I think it was failing to tackle the Blairite inheritance that we got. Just as Tony Blair accepted the Thatcherite consensus in some respects, we wrongly accepted what he left us, the legacy of laws that he put in place, like the Human Rights Act, the Equalities Act, the Climate Change Act. These are laws that make it immensely difficult for ministers to get on and do the job. I want to return to a world in which ministers are accountable to Parliament and via Parliament to the people and can deliver things once again. And that means, I think, looking at each of those laws in turn. I can envisage a great reform act in which we work through them and see which one should go, which one should be amended, and how next time we are in office, if we're lucky enough to be trusted by the public again, we can do what, frankly, we did not do this time, which is actually deliver a conservative vision for this country. And that means confronting some of those shibboleths, that legacy that we inherited from Tony Blair once and for all.
End of there. And finally, to end on a more light-hearted note, for Theresa May, it was running through fields of wheat. So what is the naughtiest thing you've ever done?
I confess I was...
You can trust us.
I was actually quite naughty as a child and a teenager. So a lot of the things I probably should not enter the public domain. I'll give you one, which I'm afraid is by no means the naughtiest thing I did.
Okay, well no, they're not answering the question as a true politician.
I did. After a few too many drinks as a teenager, I did accept a bet to climb the Christmas tree in Wolverhampton city centre, and that did not end well.
Did you get to the top?
Not quite to the top, but I got pretty high up. But I think I'll leave it there.
Were the police called?
I think I've said enough.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Robert, for joining today.
Thanks a lot, Katie. It's been a pleasure.